Hi there, Steve Kaufman here again, talking about language learning as usual. If you enjoy these videos, please subscribe to my channel. Today I want to talk about meaningful input and how it applies to my Greek learning. Okay, Stephen Krashen speaks of meaningful input, comprehensible input, that acquiring these meaningful messages, compelling input, is basically how we acquire languages, how we get languages into our brain so that we can then subsequently produce them. So, for me, Greek presents certain problems that I haven't experienced in a while. When I started on Russian, which is it's got to be over 10 years ago, Russian then was the first sort of language where most of the vocabulary was unrelated to vocabulary that I had from other languages, leaving aside Chinese and Japanese. But I'm saying, German with English, English with French, English with Spanish, there's a lot of vocabulary that you get free. When you get into Russian, the number of words that are identifiable is much, much less. But then after doing Russian, then I did, Czech, Ukrainian, Polish. When I did Romanian, of course, there's a lot of vocabulary that is similar to Italian. But Greek, there's some words, chronos for time, or chromos is color, photos is light, okay, photo. There's some of that, but overwhelmingly the vocabulary is new. You got to learn it. So it's tougher for me than what I have been experiencing over the last 10 years or so. So we have our sort of beginner stuff at Link, and then I got onto these mini stories, translating from these English mini stories, and that was a boon for me, and I'm up to 40 of them. But we are short now of the person who's producing these in English seems to have slowed down. So before I get any further here, if any of you out there, now we have all kinds of volunteers translating these mini stories into 30 plus languages, Arabic, Hebrew, I don't know, Latvian, and this is going to be in public domain and so forth and so on, and I find these stories tremendous for my Greek. Now I'm stuck. I'm up to 40. So if any of you, in addition to those of you who have volunteered to translate, if you want to create some stories, all right, then following this formula, the 3-part formula with lots of repetition, using largely high-frequency verbs. Nouns don't matter so much, but verbs. And we have 5 levels. So we now have level 1, which is basically word order, positive, negative, question. Level 2 is the different tenses. Level 3, we introduce a concept such as purpose, intent, why, because, given the fact that, verbs of motion, verbs of giving and taking, more work on tenses. That's level 3. Level 4 is probability, necessity, possibility, maybe, doubt, conditional, whatever, those kinds of things. And level 5 is where you want to express your opinion. In my view, on the other hand, it would appear, blah, 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 and more tenses. So there's 5 levels, so that at each level, you can focus on practicing patterns, because don't forget, this is primarily about gaining initially some familiarity with the patterns, how different languages express different things, and also as a place that you can go back to practice these patterns. And along the way, you pick up some vocabulary, but they aren't vocabulary heavy. So for me in my Greek, for example, if I look at a new lesson in our mini story series, there might only be 20% new words. Whereas if I pull a newspaper article in Greek, there's 55% new words. And it's just hard. It's hard, especially because there's no freebies. If I'm into, Polish from Ukrainian, 55% new words, but a lot of those words I'll know from another Slavic language. So I'm hoping maybe, again, if some of you would volunteer to write some mini stories for us in your own language, whatever that language is, we'll use it as learning material for that language. Plus, we would also like to get the English translation so we could translate it into other languages. So we start to accumulate this, again, in the public domain, collection of stories. And the advantage of having people write these stories in their various native languages is that we aren't too culturally, bound to essentially an English-speaking kind of cultural environment. So if any of you want to write stories for us, please let me know here in the comment section, or send me an email at steve@lingq.com, and we'll get you in touch with Zoran so we can get some more stories going in this series. But getting back to this meaningful content business. So here I am. I find it too difficult to deal with 50+% new words. I found a graded reader, supposedly, folk tales in Greek, but I'm not that interested in folk tales. It's okay. And folk tales have a lot of vocabulary, you know, the fox, the crow, stuff that's not necessarily relevant to me. One of the best graded readers I ever had was in Chinese, 20 lectures on Chinese culture, which used sort of a limited range of vocabulary to talk about Chinese history and Chinese culture, which is an interest of mine, and particularly in learning a new language, learning about the history and the culture is very interesting. So graded readers are great. I know Oli Richards is working on graded readers for Spanish and so forth. And of course, I want to find these wherever they are. I'll buy the ebook, put it through Calibre, convert it into a format that we could use a link, import it into link, and start learning with it. But having this meaningful content is so important, because to step from these mini stories right up to the newspaper is too difficult. I think if I get to 100 mini stories, I'll be a little further along. Another thing I wanted to mention too on meaningful content, we have this series at Link called Who Is She, which is kind of where I started with Greek, and it was very difficult for me. Very difficult. But now, having done 40 of these mini stories, I go back to Who Is She, and it's a delight. It's a delight not only to see words that you now know, but also to recognize the patterns. I mean, you're going blind initially, even though you read an explanation of how they deal with future or whatever. It just flies by you. But now that you've experienced it through these stories, especially our mini stories with all the repetition, and you have a sense of what that means and how that pattern works, and then I go back to Who Is She, and I see those patterns, and now it's just second nature, commonplace for me. It's a delight. It's always a delight to go back to some of the material that you started with and now see that, in fact, it's no longer difficult for you. Anyway, so just a little bit of a discussion on the importance of meaning comprehensible input, how we get that meaningful comprehensible input. I believe this mini story idea, which started with Blaine Ray, was then picked up by A.J. Hogue, picked up by Piotr in realpolish.pl, which is where I first discovered it, and now I want to make this available in as many languages as possible with the help of volunteers who either help us translate the stories, or possibly there are people out there who are creative and are willing to try to create these stories in their own language and also provide us with an English translation so we can include these. And if you are willing to do that, then let me know, and I'll send you this description of the 5 levels, and maybe we can move the project forward. So thank you for listening.